We're back in. You all look gorgeous, by the way, and I can't see you anymore. So you'll have to bear with me or hear you. So where did we end? We ended with the White Horse Hill burial last time, which occurred somewhere around 17th or 18th century BC. So right at the end of the early Bronze Age and coming into the middle years of, or the initial years of the Middle Bronze Age. As I said, this is a bit of a cusp in the archaeological record, because suddenly, from this sort of period or a little bit after, we start to see the landscape being marked in a very different way. Up to now, we've seen a lot of monuments. We've seen that's mostly what people were putting in the landscape that was durable and lasting, and that we see today. There's a big change in the archaeological record in the years probably around 1600 BC. Our dating's not precise for reasons that will become clear, but what we see is a sudden appearance of extensive field systems and settlements and trackways across really wide areas of Dartmoor. Square kilometres of Dartmoor are covered in what are colloquially called the reeve systems. I'm sure many of you have heard of those, but this is what they are. They are Middle Bronze Age field systems, a whole agricultural and domestic landscape, as opposed to the perhaps spiritual or ceremonial landscapes we were seeing up to now. We still have the ceremonial landscapes. The reeve systems are established. They often respect monuments that have gone before them, and we know from excavations at Shaw Moor, not Shaw Prior, on cairns, that there were still cairns being constructed and used at this time. So, and we saw last time that some monuments are going out of use. We saw the Sitterford Stone Circle was falling down by 2000 BC, so well before this, several centuries before this. But one of the questions, look at the slide there. What I'm showing you here is that's Ripon Tor, which is which you can probably see best on the Ordnance Survey map on the right. It's the same area with a LiDAR image on the left. Now, if you look at the bottom half of that LiDAR image, can you all see, and I can't hear you, so I'm just asking for effect, really, there is a series of rectangular features, and I'm going to zoom in on that so that you can see that now on the LiDAR. Can you see those field systems? And in amongst them, you see little blimps, and those are hut circles. Those are houses within this landscape. They are what we archaeologists call coaxial field systems, which basically means they're long and thin and rectangular and look a bit like ladders when they're all put close together. This is part of the Ripon Tor reef system, as it says at the top of the slide, which extends from Haytor all the way across to Buckland Common. And in the other direction, some of the modern fields, well, they're medieval fields, but they're still there in the modern landscape outside Ashburton, preserve this orientation. And so that's a big may, they may well be part of this reef system. They have extended that far in the past. So that's what they look like on the ground. This is another one here. This is the Dartmoor reef system, the biggest and the best developed one. That's what all the red lines are. They're showing you where the field system or the reefs boundaries, the field boundaries are. You can see how complicated they are, and you can see very well how, it's 5 or 6 kilometers long and almost that many wide if you take everything into account. So these are really substantial monuments, and they are internationally important. There are very few places in the country or even in Europe where we have prehistoric landscapes that are preserved this well. So we're very lucky here, and we can tend to forget that and get a bit blasé about them, but they are really very special. But they appear quite suddenly in the archaeological record, really, as far as we can tell. Admittedly, our excavation evidence isn't brilliant at the moment, so our dating needs to be refined and improved before we can really say that's the case. So why do they suddenly appear? Why does people suddenly start sort of living in the landscape more permanently, settling down, if you like, and farming these fields? Now, up to now, it's been sort of said, and the accepted view has been that this was perhaps the result of growing populations. Resources were becoming more scarce, and people were therefore having to sort of farm things more intensively and hold their land and mark it better, protect it, if you like. But we've recently been doing a little bit of work at Whole World Tour. This is an excavation we did in 2018. Some of you may have worked on this. It was a community excavation. You can see at the top there, we were excavating half a roundhouse, but also doing some other work there and looking at particularly at some of the buried soils that were associated with this roundhouse and the two reeves that were connected to it or close by. And what we found in these fossilized soils, and this is the first time this has been made vaguely public, is that we were looking at soils that preceded the reeves and preceded the roundhouse that had already possibly been ploughed or cultivated. It's not something that has previously been thought. It's been thought up to that say the White Horse Hill woman was living in a society that was quite nomadic, following the herds around the landscape, not really living very long in one place. And that may still partly be true, but it is also possible now that we are also seeing more extensive tilling of the soil than we previously suspected, because in the buried soils we can detect what's the word, colluviation. We can detect soil being eroded from hill slopes and washed down slope, and that's a sure sign of human intervention. We can also see in some of these fossilized soils that the soils are already degrading at this point, which is interesting. They are becoming a bit leached, a bit podsilized is the technical term. So it may be that we are looking at a society that is responding to its environment, that is gradually worsening. Soil is getting more degraded, and so perhaps they're farming it more intensively, trying to, keep that system going, keep living on Dartmoor while the going's good, and they can still farm it. It's still very much up in the air. We're not really sure. We're waiting on dates. It's all very much work that's ongoing. So just watch this space, really, and we're hopefully going to be answering a few long questions that have been held for a long time. So this is what reeves look like on the ground. I mean, that previous point also feeds into the debate over which has been going on between the idea that these reef systems, they're very regular, they look like they've been planned and put in place straight away, very quickly, and done perhaps under the influence of some sort of social authority, a chief, or maybe it doesn't have to be a chief, but somebody has decided, let's construct these reefs, and it's been done. They've had the power and the authority to motivate the population to do it. The opposite view is that they're actually much more gradually accumulating. We see evidence in them that their style changes over their lengths, which suggests that they are piecemeal, if you like. They're constructed in a piecemeal way, that they actually preserve preceding arrangements in the landscape, and they fossilize those landscapes. And mark them for us to see in the present day. So it may be that what we're seeing in the soils is supporting that latter view a little bit. Hard to say at the moment. It's still a debate that will rage on, I'm sure. But as far as the field archaeology is concerned, this is what reeves look like on the land on the ground. You can walk over many of them without even noticing them. They are low banks which have stones embedded in them. And you can see the one at the top there, that's White Tor, leading up to White Tor on the west of Dartmoor. The one on the bottom left is Hay Tor. I wonder how many of you have noticed that one going straight between the two rocks on the summit. And the one on the right is not far away. That's just on Hay Tor down, marching up the hill. You can almost see it from the left-hand picture there. So we don't know what they look like in the flesh. There's certainly not enough stone in them for them to be as high as our modern hedge banks. So it could be we're looking at something that was a low wall, perhaps with a hedge growing out of the top of it. We don't know if they were intended to be stock-proof, because we don't really know what was going on in the fields. Were they arable fields? Are they more for handling and managing stock? We're not sure. I suspect the answer lies somewhere between those extremes, as we have evidence from elsewhere, other sorts of evidence, I should say, that point to both sorts of agriculture. We have quernstones for grinding grain. We even have, from some excavations, grains, carbonized grains of wheat. So we know that there was wheat growing going on, probably other crops as well, but we don't have the evidence for those. We have evidence from Shaw Moor. If you go to the Princetown Visitor Centre, you will see a cast hanging on the wall when you can get in there, that has footprints which were taken from a trackway that ran alongside a reeve. So Middle Bronze Age footprints of cattle, of sheep, of ponies, and a badger, I think, is the other one. But I'm not sure we were farming badgers. But, there are plenty of evidence for livestock there as well. So lots still to find out. But the other element of these landscapes is, of course, the settlement. And those are they're marked on Ordnance Survey maps as hut circles. Probably a bit of a derogatory term because these are sophisticated structures. They're not huts, they're houses. So, perhaps we should be calling them house circles. I don't know. I don't think it'll catch on, but it's worth remembering. And these are some examples of what hut circles like. They're circles of stone in the ground. I've already showed you the one at Holwell that was under excavation. I'm struggling to remember where all these are. The one on the bottom right, obviously, is on the Fernworthy Reservoir when the water's low. The one on the left is Haytor. You can see Haytor off in the distance. And I can't for the life of me remember where the top right-hand one is. But might be Trowlsworthy, I'm not sure. But on the top left, you can see a LiDAR image of a settlement. They occur either individually, just huts on their own, or in groups, or they're enclosed. You can see the top left is one just north of White Tor. You can see the line running off west to east. That's a reeve. And you can see this enclosure, and so as is the other line running sort of roughly northeast, southwest. The other bank there is an enclosure around a whole group of roundhouses, which are visible as sort of pimples, I guess you'd call them, on the image. But what do these look like? What did they look like? And this is a rather nice reconstruction image with a cutaway in it that shows you something of what we think they look like. To be fair, we haven't really got that many that have been excavated in modern times. It's perhaps about 10 in the last 40 or 50 years. So using modern archaeological techniques. Many more than that have been excavated certainly by the Dartmoor Exploration Committee, that our early archaeologists back around the years around 1900. Although they didn't call it excavation, they called it clearing. So quite shocking to us, the techniques they use, but I won't denigrate them too much, because without them there's an awful lot we wouldn't know, even though we don't know that much. They have made the assumption in this reconstruction drawing a little bit about the thatch, which looks to me like it's come from wheat or some sort of cereal crop growing, but we don't really know what the roofs were made of. And to emphasize also, we are reconstructing this. This is a design that is very similar to an Iron Age roundhouse. It's an architectural form, the roundhouse, that lasts a very long time. But we don't know what was on the roofs of these. It could have been bracken, it might have been heather, or any number of different types of vegetation. We're not sure. I will bang on yet again about our reconstruction drawings. Yet again, we've got people who look like they're at Glastonbury. They're a bit drab. And we have to bear in mind when looking at something like this that it is based on the evidence we have and sensible, reasonable extrapolations. It could well be that there may have been paint, there may have been carvings, all sorts that we just can't access at the moment. We have to sort of bear that in mind when we're thinking about them. So this is a busy landscape that lasts from around 1600 BC, perhaps for about 300 or even 400 years. Sorry, I just couldn't. Oh, what have I done now? There we go. Before Dartmoor is abandoned, apparently, to settlement. The roundhouses are abandoned. The reef systems seem to fall into disuse. We're not sure why that is. The big factor that is always quoted is that it's climate deterioration. it became cold and wet and no longer tenable to live in this way on Dartmoor. And we do have the work that's been done. There's a limited amount of work on Dartmoor's climate that has been done. And most of that focuses the techniques we used to undertake that is by looking at some of the microscopic creatures that respond to wetness in bogs. And as I spoke last time about the peat and how it preserves organic material, well, it preserves entire communities of tiny microbes or microscopic creatures living in the bogs at this time. And those communities change over time and they reflect changing conditions. So the bog at Tor Royal, which is quite deep and certainly has peat dating to this period, tells us that there was indeed a climate downturn around somewhere about the beginning of the first millennium BC. So in the centuries around 1000 BC, the climate started to go downhill, which meant, and it possibly is a factor in Dartmoor's abandonment by people living in this way. We can't say that for sure. There could be any number of other factors, and we'll see that a bit later in the medieval period, where we have a little bit more information, but we just don't know why that was. But we do know that largely the landscape is abandoned, not farmed as it has been. The reeves are abandoned. That doesn't mean the landscape is abandoned entirely, and we do have information from Sitterford Stone Circle that I mentioned earlier. We looked at the peat in and around the circle, and that contains sequences of what paleoecologists call NPPs, or non-pollen polymorphs, and what they mean really are fungal spores, and in this particular case fungal spores that grow on animal poo. The more of those you have, the more animals there are around, and there's a certain natural background you might expect, but anything above that may well be because we have grazing animals, and we certainly have peaks in around this sort of 1000 BC, 900 BC mark, the late Bronze Age, that suggests that we may well have grazing animals up here. So people are using Dartmoor for grazing, which is a practice that is going to continue for a very long time, after this point in time. But that's about the only real evidence we have for about 1,000 years of Dartmoor's past, from the end of the Middle Bronze Age all the way up to the Iron Age. And even in the Iron Age, not a lot of work has been done. What we're mostly aware of is that around the fringes of Dartmoor, somewhere in the sort of 400 BC, we would imagine, because we don't really have the evidence in terms of dating. We're dating by analogy with other hill forts. We have a series of hill forts. The one I'm showing you on the screen is Worcester Castle. The top left is before it was cleared of trees. The bottom left is afterwards, obviously, and the right hand is excavation that was carried out by the National Trust a couple of years ago. It was the year of the Beast from the East, anyway, 2 years ago, I think. What that photo doesn't show you, it doesn't give you the sense of scale of this thing. It is 7 meters from the bottom of that excavated ditch to the top of the modern rampart. It's one of those, if you stand there looking at it, I can remember standing there looking at it, not being able to quite get my head around how deep that ditch was. But for all the effort that went into it, there were no artifacts recovered from it. No charcoal or anything that was datable came out of it, unfortunately. So although we have some information on how the rampart and the ditch were constructed, we don't have any dates, unfortunately. But it is the first excavation on one of Dartmoor's hill forts for quite a long time, back in at least 100 years, I think. So apart from that, we do have another question has come up in relation to the Iron Age. Excavations at Gold Park, which is Shapley Common, just over the hill from Grimspound, on some roundhouses in the 80s, revealed that they weren't Middle Bronze Age roundhouses, which is what the assumption usually is on Dartmoor, but actually were constructed in the Iron Age. So that raises, and that's the only place we've found this, because not much excavation has been done, but it does raise the question of wider settlement during the Iron Age. What was going on? Were some of the roundhouses we see on and around Dartmoor, are they Iron Age rather than Middle Bronze Age? again, we're not sure, but it's a possibility. We also find Iron Age and also sometimes Roman pottery in some of the more roundhouses that have been excavated in more modern times. They have yielded pottery of those dates, so in and around them. So are we looking at Middle Bronze Age structures that have been reused often in a much later period? It's a question that is there and needs investigating. So unfortunately, I'm zipping over the Iron Age there, and also, as you may notice, just completely skipping the Roman period, because we have very little Roman archaeology on Dartmoor. More is emerging over time, probably around, and there probably is more settlement, that sort of thing, around the edges of Dartmoor. And it probably, I would imagine, reflects very much what was going on in the Iron Age. The Roman period in the southwest, it does appear like as if the locals sort of looked up, went, oh, look, the Romans are here, and then went back to doing whatever they were doing anyway. I'm being slightly facetious. There were significant changes in the way people lived, but things like the settlement pattern don't really change that much in many parts of the southwest. So again, we're in one of these gaps in Dartmoor's archaeological past. There are several of them, and they are quite lengthy and quite dark. And we start to get an inkling of what's to come with some of our inscribed stones. These are part of a wider corpus of inscribed stones across the southwest, particularly in Cornwall, that are probably early Christian, many of them in origin. And I think the two examples, I'm sorry about the photo on the top left, it was the only one I could find. These two are cross-marked stones, but there are memorials which have Latin inscriptions on them, just basically memorializing an individual. If you want to see one of those, there's a good one in the that's kept in Lussley Parish Church. If you want to have a look at that. So these date from the immediate post-Roman centuries, and that's pretty much all the information we have of that period. We don't know where people are living. That's not a picture that's unique to Dartmoor. It used to be called the Dark Ages for a good reason. It's hard for us to spot some of the archaeology, and it may well be that the reason we're not seeing some of the archaeology of this period is that it underlies modern settlements or modern farms. So that's something that is constantly on our mind. It may also be that some of our enclosures, such as the Iron Age hill forts I've spoken about, some of those may be reoccupied at this time. It's certainly the case. That is certainly the case elsewhere in the country with Iron Age hill forts. So again, not a lot of research has been done on this period, and it is crying out to be. But we do have some very firm evidence from the early medieval period, a little bit later than that, and that's Lidford. Lidford itself is a foundation of Alfred the Great, or at least that's when we have a record of it first, when he founds one of his fortified settlements known as a burh, that's B-U-R-H, which he constructed in the late 9th century as a strategy against Viking raids. Which worked very well. Lidford appears to be one of these, or well, it is one of these. It's on a very steep-sided spur, as I'm sure most of you know, and it has had excavation in the interior in the 1960s, which is sadly at the moment unpublished, and that forms quite an important priority for us at the park, is to find some way of gathering the money together to get that published, because it's an important excavation, and we also know that there are some signs that there is earlier settlement here. There are pieces of fragments of pottery that may predate the Alfredian burh by some centuries. So again, a fascinating site that really needs a lot more work than has been done on it, and well, hopefully we'll see that in the future. But when we really start to see more information, again, we're in Lidford there in that image. We are, sorry, I haven't got a pointer again, the extreme left of that plan where you have a triangle and an earthwork on the end where it says ringwork. That's what we're looking at here. This is a Norman, following the Norman conquest. This is a Norman construction, really quite large in terms of the depths of its ditches and the ramparts, if you've ever been there, but quite small inside. Probably just established there to hold the local population in place while the Normans got about the business of taking over and ruling the country. Again, it has been excavated. Quite a lot of it has been excavated, but we haven't seen a publication. And again, we're crying out to see that, because I think from what I've read somewhere, huge amounts of burnt grain were taken from the burnt. There was burned buildings inside were taken from it that really need looking at. And we need to understand them really to see how Norman rule was imposed on this part of the country, if you like. I'm aware that I'm galloping through this, but I sort of have to. Anything I say here almost could be the basis of another talk entirely, and I'm skating over it and doing it terrible disservice, really, because it's fascinating stuff, a lot of it. So that's the first of several castles we see in Lidford. If we go back to that slide, you can see on the plan on the top left, you can see that the later castle is there, that with the keep of which becomes Lidford Prison, used by the stannaries later on. But also we have places like Oakhampton Castle, which became an important centre. The Earl of Devon, I think, had that as one of his strongholds. And there are others. There are Motte Baileys. There's in different parts, all around, again, around the fringes of Dartmoor. But one of really the jewels in our crown is our medieval settlement and our medieval landscapes, very much like the Bronze Age, really. But what we see in the sort of late 12th and the 13th century, we see a period of climatic warming. Conditions are really good, and what that does across the country is create the conditions for population growth. People could grow more food or produce more food. The population increased. And what that meant on Dartmoor, around the edges of Dartmoor, was land became quite scarce. Resources were hard to find. And so populations gradually expanded onto the fringes of the uplands, which was great while that lasted. But eventually they established farmsteads, as you can see here. But eventually what happened was the climatic downturn and the start of the Little Ice Age in the 14th century. Not a nice time to be alive, I always think. The early decades of the 14th century saw famine in successive years, and a cattle murrain that killed. It wasn't just cattle; I think it was sheep as well. It killed something like a sixth or an eighth of the livestock in Europe, not just Britain or Dartmoor. And then, of course, in the middle years of that century comes the Black Death. So not a great time to be alive, really. But what that led to and I am simplifying this massively, what that led to for Dartmoor settlement is a retreat then from the uplands. It's probably a lot more complicated than this for each individual settlement, but major factors are the climate downturn was making life difficult. And to give you an example of that, the top picture there is Hound Tor medieval village. There are 3 specialized buildings for drying out grain there, and that's in the good times. So people were harvesting grain and having to dry it out. So they're living on the margins of what is possible here. Climatic downturn makes that impossible, and then you have the Black Death, and what that does, I suppose, fortuitously, is it kills an awful lot of people in and around sort of in the lowlands where the land is, and people don't need to live on the fringes of Dartmoor anymore. They can move into the lowlands where they can farm. So what we have archaeologically is a mass of abandoned settlements around, and these are just some examples. I've said about Hound Tor at the top. That's at the bottom on the left. That's High House Waste, and on the right that's Trollsworthy. You can very clearly see that the Longhouse, and that's what I wanted to mention here. The Longhouse. It's an architectural form, because we're now coming into a period where we're seeing things archaeologically, buildings, that we can still see being lived in today. So we get a very good idea of what, there we are, a Dartmoor Longhouse, higher uppercut. We are getting a very good idea of what the archaeology looked like in reality. A longhouse, for those who don't know, is basically a long rectangular building with opposing doors on each of the long sides, and the passage between those 2 doors would separate the living quarters for people on the left, and a shippen for animals on the right. So that's the original architecture, and you'd have an open hearth in the middle of the living quarters, probably. A higher uppercut has been altered. It's certainly had sort of Tudor chimney stack inserted into it, and various other adaptations, like an upper floor and a ceiling over the hall. So that's a common story for many of these buildings. But if you get the chance to go there, do, because stepping into the ship on, it's pretty much like stepping back into the 14th century. It's hardly changed. Fantastic, without the Black Death or anything like that, honestly. So you get a real feel for what living in one of these houses might have been like. And because the medieval period obviously is not as remote to us as the prehistoric period, we are seeing different sorts of archaeology that survive and obviously have resonance with us today. The top left hand is the Buckfast Abbey guest house at the abbey there, but also we have these across Dartmoor. We have the crosses, which are very famous, justly so. They tended to be markers. They give us an insight into how people may have viewed Dartmoor at this time. As I'll say in a minute, it was a place of work and certainly of grazing. It's a place where animals were brought from all over Devon to graze in the summer months. That is an entire topic in itself, which I just don't have time to go into. But I quite like the crosses because they mark routeways. They are there to mark the routeways across the moor. This was a time when Dartmoor was trackless. It's hard to think of today, but it was a dangerous place, a place where travellers got lost. They died. So the cross was there, perhaps as reassurance that God was with you and guiding you, but also as a practical marker of where the route was. So, you know, they stand there still today, and they're sort of lonely markers of routeways in the past, if you like. So I wanted now to turn to perhaps. We've had the Bronze Age. We've looked at a bit at the medieval period. Those are two of the jewels in Dartmoor's archaeological crown. And now I think we need to turn to industry. This is a picture of a LiDAR image of the Obruk, which is Holm Moors off to the east there. Hexworthy's off to the top, off the top of the map, or top of the image. And what you're looking at there is a landscape that is a result of tin working. It has tin working from all the periods, from the medieval period upwards, in that landscape there. And the medieval period is when we first get a picture of that. We discussed right at the beginning of this about that we really don't know when the origins of tin working on Dartmoor were. I suspect they are as early as the Bronze Age, but at the moment we can't prove it. When we first see it in historical terms is in documents of the 12th century. We start to see that tin working is going on a very large scale up here. And this is, in this period, is being undertaken by tin streaming, which is the use of water to wash away overburden in all the stream valleys of Dartmoor, pretty much, to expose tin grounds. And what those are eroded remains of tin deposits. Tin over millions of years in these deposits has been eroded, and because it's heavy and dense, the mineral cassiterite, it accumulates in stream valleys, and you take the overburden away and you have a rich resource there. And what that does is it creates, if I go back to that Obruk image, you can see that the LiDAR image there is showing you the course of the river has been etched out. It's now a flat-bottomed line, really, a band, a zone, if you like, down the river valley with lots of earthworks in the bottom, but it's well defined on each side by an escarpment, and that's the limit of where the tin stream has reached. All the earthworks in the middle have been left behind by them extracting tin, and they reach the limit of where the tin ground was, and they stop, and that leaves this escarpment. And you can see that in the top left photo there. This is on Haytor. And what you're looking at there, if you have a look at that, you can see on left and right are these very steep escarpments. They are several meters high in this case. But in the ground in between them, the flat ground, you can see water channels that are still there now. They're a bit sinuous in that, and they're parallel. They're showing you where tin streaming went on and how the tinners directed the water to get it where they wanted it so they could work the tin ground. And that's a really good example of what's left behind. It doesn't always look that good. Sometimes it's chaotic and full of rubble and all sorts of other stuff, and you can't really understand how it worked. But that's a good example. And in the best examples, you'll be able to actually unpick that and understand which phases of working happened first, and what order that, you know, what was how they worked it. The other two images on this page, I'll show you another part of the tin working process, and this is a stamping mill. Once the ore came out of the tin ground, it needed to be crushed up to a size that would be suitable for smelting. And this is a building. I can't remember which one this is. It's off Borotel Reservoir, but never mind. What it does is it shows you the building that would be run by water power, where the stamps, which would be vertical rods that would go up and down with iron shod ends, and the ore would be passed underneath and be stamped by them as they were driven by water power. One of the great pieces of evidence for that you can see in these two images, those two dimpled stones, and they're showing you, they're the mortar stones, and those are the stones that the stamps were hitting as they went up and down. And they wear this groove out, and eventually it wears out, and the operators would remove it and replace it, and you get these discarded mortar stones that are a surefire sign of tin stamping going on. There are other forms of evidence for this. There are the smelting mills themselves, the blowing houses as they're called, where you find mould stones to which molten tin was poured. That's characteristic evidence of that. We also have more recently coming out as evidence the melias. That's a funny word, but what these are mounds, and they are situated in peat bogs usually. They look very like cairns, prehistoric cairns, but they aren't. If you look closely and you're lucky enough to find one that a sheep has had a scrape out of the side off, you'll see they're packed with charcoal. And it's where medieval charcoal makers made the peat charcoal that drove the furnaces that smelted tin. That's a form of evidence that's only really recently been recognised, and there is work ongoing at the moment looking at those, surveying them and understanding them, hopefully excavating one so we can understand them a little more. So the medieval period saw extraction of tin through stream working mostly, but over time those sources became exhausted, and tinners started to turn to the original sources of the tin in lodes in the ground, actually in the rock itself. And first they started to excavate just deep trenches along these, and you can see this is Bennett's Cross and Warren House Inn area, Birchtor. I'm sure you all know where that is, but you can see the Ordnance Survey has these sort of roughly northeast to southwest trending lines of earthworks marked. But if we replace that with a LiDAR view of the same image, you can see these really deep trenches that have been excavated entirely by people accessing the lodes that are still in the ground. And that's a process that really starts in the late medieval period, in somewhere around in the 15th century, and lasts a couple of hundred years as tinners continue to extract tin. It's just a bit more difficult to get at it this way, a bit more labour intensive, I'd imagine. But eventually even that source of tin runs out, and what tinners are then forced to do, it doesn't run out. What happens is they can no longer access the depths they need to get to without the whole thing filling with water. So by the 16th century, miners are starting to go underground to dig shafts into these lodes where they can find them, which have water-driven pumps to remove the water. It's probably the case that, unlike Cornwall, many of Dartmoor's tin lodes were largely eroded away, and all that was left were the stubs of them at the base. And so what you end up with is that the late medieval and early post-medieval miners are removing most of that in their trenches and their what are called beamworks, and leaving not very much behind. And so the 19th century, if you look into it, or the 18th, 19th century, when miners are underground, in most cases, most ventures seem to fail. They don't make very much money. There's a lot of skullduggery going on. It's the capitalist system at its very worst, as miners are being a little dishonest sometimes, or a little over enthusiastic, attracting investors, and everything falls through. What that does mean archaeologically is that many of our mine sites have fantastic surface installations because a lot of money was spent on them, but just not very much ore came out of the ground. Again, that's an entire topic in itself. Any one mine could probably give you a hugely entertaining sometimes, some of the scoundrels that were around and some of the things they got up to. But the mines you can see here, the top left, that's one of the trenches here at Birchtor. Huge things. And again, you get the trenches and you get the shafts along the bottom from the later miners, which are a wonderful illustration of the history of tin working. Down at the bottom left is one of the mining installations on the Obrook. That's Hexworthy, a modern, I think early 20th century buddles, the circular things for sorting the ore in the foreground there. Again, there's an interesting, typical of Dartmoor, there are layers of archaeology everywhere. This one has been shot to pieces by the American Army before the Second World War. So we're seeing another phase of Dartmoor's archaeology just in the evidence there. You can't actually see it, but that wall at the back is full of bullet holes. And on the right, there's Brimps, in Bluebell time, one of the wheel pits at the Brimps mine, which you can visit a trail there and visit that one. It's a very good one done by the Dartmoor Tin Research Group, so I recommend that definitely. But tin working often grabs the limelight always on Dartmoor. It was obviously very important and the most important industry sort of in the amount of material produced, but there are many other and sometimes very odd industries on Dartmoor. One of them, at the top there, that's powder mills, that's gunpowder production, an architectural form there that is purely about gunpowder manufacture. That gap in the middle of the building held a water wheel which drove machinery on either side of it. The roof, interestingly enough, was made of canvas, which meant if there was an explosion, the roof blew up and didn't damage the machinery too much. Don't know what happened to the people, though, if that happened. So health and safety there. The bottom two are obviously Haytor and the Haytor tramway, and representing the granite quarrying industries. I can't possibly put enough images up to show you some of the others. We have an ice factory up near Soughton. We have ferroceramic brickworks down near Dewstone. And most recently, we have coming out of a site on Eastern Dartmoor, we have what appears to be a glassworking site, probably dating from the post-medieval period. Still to be confirmed, and still work going on that. It's on private land, which is why I'm being cagey about where it actually is. But we're pretty confident it's a glassworking site. So not what we were expecting on Dartmoor at all. Although I know we've got the Meldon site, the Meldon bottleworking site there. But this is earlier and very interesting, very exciting stuff. So the post-medieval period, we have history starts to become much more important, our documentary evidence. And what that inevitably leads to is we have an embarrassment of wealth, a wealth of evidence now in this period, which we didn't have necessarily in previous periods. And so archaeology splits into lots of different archaeologies. Again, I can't possibly cover them all, but some few possibilities here are military archaeology. Dartmoor has been the scene of military training since the 19th century. There is a plentiful evidence for what the military got up to, but also not only that, there's an archaeology of its changing weapons and changing tactics over time. Up at the top left, there's Hanging Stone Hill. That's one of the observation posts. Some of those are now scheduled. They're considered to be nationally important. And there's Royal Horse Artillery on the right, training up on Dartmoor. One of my favourites is the anti-tank range, which I'm showing on a LiDAR image there, that triangular or angled feature, if you like, in the middle of the image. That's a track which towed a target, which was fired at by whatever anti-tank weapon was being used. We have that pictured in an early form on Luftwaffe photographs from 1940. But subsequent aerial photos show it changing its form through time as different weapons are introduced and it's put to different uses. It's quite a fascinating story. But there are other types of archaeology up here that either are or could be. One of them is the archaeology of forestry. That's something that's contentious. It's been going on since the 20s. Big areas of Dartmoor are under forest, so there is a whole archaeology of that. An archaeology of water supply, that goes back at least as far as Drake's Leat, supplying water to Devonport and Plymouth. And right the way up into the 50s when the Avon Dam was built. Again, these are along with military archaeology, are also intertwined with a history of conservation. The conservation movement itself, the battles that were fought over these different issues, are there, and they're part of Dartmoor's past. A future one may be the archaeology of leisure. We have that's a picture of the Tour of Britain, the final stages on Hay Tor. But all of them contribute to the many layered past and the modern character of Dartmoor. And they're all worth thinking about when we go about our daily business on Dartmoor. And with that, I hope I haven't gone on too long. I will stop sharing my screen now and return to the room. Hopefully you're all still there.
Well, thank you very much, Lee. That was fantastic, really interesting. So on behalf of everyone else, I just like to say thank you for that.